Chapter 4. Look out, Hitler, here we come. Slapton Sands, a pottery, April 1st through June 5th, 1944. The 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, and the 4th Infantry Division made up the 7th Corps. The 7th Corps and the 5th Corps, 1st Infantry and 29th Infantry Divisions, made up the U.S. First Army, General Omar Bradley commanding. Eisenhower had given Bradley the task of establishing a beachhead on each side of the mouth of the Douve River, where the French coast makes a right angle. Running to the east is the Calvados coast, running to the north is the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. The 5th Corps was to take the Calvados coast, code name for the target area Omaha Beach, while the 7th Corps was to take the base of the Cotentin, code name Utah Beach. The 7th Corps, at Utah, would be on the extreme right flank of the invasion area, which stretched from the mouth of the Orne River on the left, east, some 65 to 70 kilometers to the Cotentin. Eisenhower needed to provide sufficient width to the invasion to bring in enough infantry divisions in the first wave to overpower the enemy dug in behind Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Hitler made only one big mistake when he built his Atlantic Wall, the paratroopers like to say. He forgot to put a roof on it. In one way, Utah was the easiest of the 5 assault beaches. At the British and Canadian beaches, Sword, Juno, and Gold, east of Omaha, the numerous vacation homes, small shops, and hotels and casinos that lined the coast provided the Germans with excellent protection for machine gun nests, while at Omaha, a bluff rising from the beach to a height of 200 to 300 feet gave the German defenders, dug into a trench system on a World War II scale, the ability to shoot down on troops coming out of the landing craft. But Utah had neither bluff nor houses. There were some fixed defenses made of reinforced concrete, containing artillery and machine guns. The biggest was at La Madeleine, in the middle of Utah. The fortification took its name from a nearby religious shrine that dated back to Viking days. But the gradual slope and low sand dunes at Utah meant that getting across and beyond the beach was not going to be as difficult as at Omaha. The problem at Utah was what lay inland. Behind the sand dunes was low ground, used by the Norman farmers for grazing cattle. 4 narrow, unimproved roads ran inland from the beach. These roads were raised a meter or two above the ground. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German commander, had flooded the fields with the idea of forcing any troops and armor coming inland to use the roads, causeways, Eisenhower's planners called them. Rommel had most of his artillery in camouflaged positions or reinforced casements and bunkers back from the flooded area, where it could bombard the roads. Rommel had his infantry prepared to take up defensive positions along the western end of the roads, where it could repel any troops moving up them. The task Eisenhower gave the 101st was to seize these causeway exits. The method to be used was a night drop. The aim was to disrupt the Germans, create surprise and havoc, and get control of those exits and destroy the big guns before the Germans could react. It would be an intricate, tricky, and risky operation. To have any chance of success, it would be necessary to practice. For the practice to be realistic, it would be necessary to find a piece of English coastline similar to Utah Beach. Slapton Sands in Devonshire, in southwestern England, was similar to Utah. A long, narrow stretch of beach was separated from dry ground by a shallow lake and adjoining swamp. 2 bridges crossed from the shoreline to high ground. And so it was that the 7th Corps carried out its rehearsal for the part it was to play on D-Day at Slapton Sands. At the end of April, the entire 7th Corps participated in Exercise Tiger. E Company rode in trucks to a resort hotel on the seashore at Torquay, where it spent a comfortable night. The next day, April 26th, it was back into the trucks for a ride to an area back from Slapton Sands from which all civilians had been evacuated. The company slept in the field until midnight, when trucks brought the men forward to a simulated drop zone. After assembly, the company marched overland through a mist to an elevated point a mile back from the beach and set up a defensive position guarding the bridge. At dawn, Webster wrote, "We could see a vast fleet of amphibious craft moving slowly into land. I've never seen so many ships together at one time. An invasion fleet is the most impressive sight in the world." What he had not seen was the disaster of the previous evening. German torpedo boats had slipped in among the LSTs and other big assault craft carrying the 4th Infantry. The Germans sank 2 LSTs and damaged others. More than 900 men drowned. The incident was covered up by the Allies for fear that it would hurt morale among the troops scheduled to go to France in LSTs. It remained covered up for more than 40 years, evidently out of embarrassment. Webster, watching the men of the 4th Infantry come up from the beach and pass through E Company's positions, noted that they were sweating, cursing, panting. He also recorded that the officers informed the men that, "We cannot write about our Torquay excursion." In the afternoon, the company made a 25-mile march and then bivouacked in a woods for the night. In the morning of April 28th, it rode in trucks back to Altbourne. That weekend, Malarkey, Chuck Grant, Skip Muck, and Joe Toya got passes to London, with Muck's best friend from Tonawanda, New York, Fritz Nieland of the 501st PIR. There they met Nieland's brother, Bob, who was a squad leader in the 82nd Airborne and who had seen action in North Africa and Sicily. They spent the evening in a pub listening to Bob Nieland talk about combat. He made a remark that Malarkey never forgot. "If you want to be a hero, the Germans will make one out of you real quick. Dead." On the train going back to Altbourne, Malarkey told Muck that it sounded to him like Bob Nieland had lost his effectiveness. Back in Altbourne in the first week of May, E Company went through more problems, attacking gun positions, bridges, causeways, and other objectives, once attacking after a real jump, other times simulating the air flight and jumping out of trucks. From May 9th to 12th, the 101st held its dress rehearsal for D-Day, code name Operation Eagle. The entire division participated. Easy used the same airfield it would use on D-Day, Apateri. Personnel and equipment were loaded onto the same aircraft the company would use on the real thing. The takeoff, drop, and assembly followed the plan as close to the letter as possible, including spending the same amount of time in flight. Climbing aboard the C-47s was difficult because of all the gear each man carried. Individuals were overloaded, following the age-old tendency of soldiers going into combat to attempt to be ready for every conceivable emergency. The vest and long drawers issued each man were impregnated to ward off a possible chemical attack. It made them cumbersome. They stank. They itched. They kept in body heat and caused torrents of sweat. The combat jacket and trousers were also treated. The men carried a pocket knife in the lapel of their blouses, to be used to cut themselves out of their harness if they landed in a tree. In their baggy trousers pockets, they had a spoon, razor, socks, cleaning patches, flashlight, maps, 3-day supply of K-rations, an emergency ration package, 4 chocolate bars, a pack of charms, powdered coffee, sugar, and matches, ammunition, a compass, 2 fragmentation grenades, an anti-tank mine, a smoke grenade, a gammon bomb, a 2-pound plastic explosive for use against tanks, and cigarettes, 2 cartons per man. The soldier topped his uniform with a webbing belt and braces, a .45 pistol, standard for non-coms and officers. Privates had to get their own, and most did. Water canteen, shovel, first aid kit, and bayonet. Over this went his parachute harness, his main parachute in its backpack, and reserve parachute hooked on in front. A gas mask was strapped to his left leg, and a jump knife bayonet to his right. Across his chest the soldier slung his musette bag with his spare underwear and ammunition, and in some cases TNT sticks, along with his broken-down rifle or machine gun or mortar diagonally up and down across his front, under his reserve chute pack, leaving both hands free to handle the risers. Over everything he wore his Mae West life jacket. Finally, he put on his helmet. Some men added a third knife. Others found a place for extra ammunition. Gordon, carrying his machine gun, figured he weighed twice his normal weight. Nearly every man had to be helped into the C-47. Once aboard, the men were so wedged in they could not move. General Taylor had moved heaven and earth to get enough C-47s for Operation Eagle. The planes were in constant demand for logistical support throughout ETO, and Troop Carrier Command came last on the list. It was cheated on equipment. The fuel tanks did not have armor protection from flak. Easy got its briefing for Eagle on May 10th and 11th. The objective was a gun battery covering the beach. At dusk, on May 11th, Easy took off. The planes made legs over England, flying for about 2.5 hours. Shortly after midnight, the company jumped. For Easy, the exercise went smoothly. For other companies, there were troubles. 2nd Battalion Headquarters Company was with a group that ran into a German air raid over London. Flak was coming up. The formation broke up. The pilots could not locate the DZ. 8 of the 9 planes carrying Company H of the 502nd dropped their men on the village of Ramsbury, 9 miles from the DZ. 28 planes returned to their airfields with the paratroopers still aboard. Others jumped willy-nilly, leading to many accidents. Nearly 500 men suffered broken bones, sprains, and other injuries. The only consolation the airborne commanders could find in this mess was that by tradition, a bad dress rehearsal leads to a great opening night. On the last day of May, the company marched down to trucks lined up on the Hungerford Road. Half the people of Altbourne, and nearly all the unmarried girls, were there to wave goodbye. There were many tears. The baggage left behind gave some hope that the boys would be back. Training had come to an end. There had been 22 months of it, more or less continuous. The men were as hardened physically as it was possible for human beings to be. Not even professional boxers or football players were in better shape. They were disciplined, prepared to carry out orders instantly and unquestioningly. They were experts in the use of their own weapon, knowledgeable in the use of other weapons, familiar with and capable of operating German weapons. They could operate radios, knew a variety of hand signals, could recognize various smoke signals. They were skilled in tactics, whether the problem was attacking a battery or a blockhouse or a trench system or a hill defended by machine guns. Each man knew the duties and responsibilities of a squad or platoon leader and was prepared to assume those duties if necessary. They knew how to blow bridges, how to render artillery pieces inoperative. They could set up a defensive position in an instant. They could live in the field, sleep in a foxhole, march all day and through the night. They knew and trusted each other. Within Easy Company, they had made the best friends they had ever had or would ever have. They were prepared to die for each other. More important, they were prepared to kill for each other. They were ready. But of course, going into combat for the first time is an ultimate experience for which one can never be fully ready. It is anticipated for years in advance. It is a test that produces anxiety, eagerness, tension, fear of failure, anticipation. There is a mystery about the thing, heightened by the fact that those who have done it cannot put into words what it is like, how it feels, except that getting shot at and shooting to kill produce extraordinary emotional reactions. No matter how hard you train, nor however realistic the training, no one can ever be fully prepared for the intensity of the real thing. And so the men of Easy Company left Altbourne full of self-confidence and full of trepidation. Easy's marshalling area in southwestern England, about 10 miles from the coast, was an open field beside the airstrip at a pottery. The company lived in pyramidal tents. Our standards of living went up considerably, Webster wrote. We stuffed ourselves at the hospitable mess hall, a wall tent. Want some more, boys? Just help yourselves. Take all you want. On such luxuries as fried chicken, fruit cocktail, white bread with lots of butter, the realization that we were being fattened for the slaughter didn't stop us from going back for seconds. Troops wearing German uniforms and carrying German weapons roamed constantly through the marshalling area to familiarize the men with what the enemy looked like and what weapons they carried. On June 2nd, the company officers got their briefings from former E Company officers, First Lieutenant Nixon, now 2nd Battalion S2, and Captain Hester, S3. On sand tables, they showed terrain features, houses, roads, dunes, and the rest, and on maps. Nixon and Hester explained that Easy would be dropping near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, about 10 kilometers south of Sainte-Mère-Église, with the objective of killing the German garrison in the village and seizing the exit at Causeway No. 2, the road coming up from the coast just north of the village of Poupeville. The 3rd Platoon was given the task of blowing up a communications line leading inland from La Madeleine. The detailed information given out by Nixon and Hester and by other intelligence officers briefing other companies was truly amazing. They passed around aerial photographs of the DZ that showed not only roads, buildings, and the like, but even foxholes. One member of the 506th recalled that his company was told that the German commandant at its objective Saint-Côme-du-Mont owned a white horse and was going with a French schoolteacher who lived on a side street just 2 buildings away from a German gun emplacement that was zeroed in on Causeway No. 1. He took his dog for a walk every evening at 2000 hours. Each officer had to learn the company mission by heart, know his own and every other platoon's mission to the most minute detail, and be able to draw a map of the whole area by memory. One point was made very clear, that the Germans relied less on their fixed coastal defenses than on their ability to counterattack. Mobile reserve units would start hitting the 4th Infantry wherever its units threatened to make it across the causeways. The briefers, therefore, impressed strongly on the officers that regardless of where their platoons were or how many of their men they had managed to collect, if they spotted German units moving toward the causeways, they should fire upon them with everything they had. Even a 5-minute delay, thus imposed on the Germans, could mean the difference between success and failure at Utah Beach. The importance of each mission was likewise emphasized most effectively. Winters said, "I had the feeling that we were going in there and win the whole damn thing ourselves. It was our baby." On June 3rd, Winters and the other platoon leaders walked their men through the briefing tent, showing them the sand tables and maps, telling them what they had learned. Sergeant Guarnieri needed to use the latrine. He grabbed a jacket and strolled over to the facility. Sitting down, he put his hand in a pocket and pulled out a letter. It was addressed to Sergeant Martin. Guarnieri had taken Martin's jacket by mistake, but Guarnieri read it anyway. Martin's wife was the author. They had been married in Georgia in 1942, and Mrs. Martin knew most of the members of the company. She wrote, "Don't tell Bill, Guarnieri, but his brother was killed in Cassino, Italy. You can't imagine the anger I felt," Guarnieri said later. "I swore that when I got to Normandy, there ain't no German going to be alive. I was like a maniac. When they sent me into France, they turned a killer loose, a wild man." On June 4th, Easy was issued its ammunition, $10 worth of new French francs just printed in Washington, an escape kit containing a silk map of France, a tiny brass compass, and a hacksaw. The men were given an American flag to sew on the right sleeves of their jump jackets. Officers removed their insignia from their uniforms and painted vertical stripes on the back of their helmets. NCOs had horizontal stripes. Everyone was given the verbal challenge, flash, the password, thunder, and the response, welcome. They were also given small metal dime store crickets for alternative identification. 1 squeeze, click-clack, to be answered by 2, click-clack, click-clack. The men spent the day cleaning weapons, sharpening knives, adjusting the parachutes, checking the equipment over and over, chain-smoking cigarettes. Many of the men shaved their heads or got mohawk haircuts, bald on each side with a 1 or 2 inch strip of short hair running from the forehead to the back of the neck. Privates Forrest Guth and Joseph Liepgott did the cutting at 15 cents per man. Colonel Sink came around, saw the haircutting going on, smiled, and said, "I forgot to tell you, some weeks ago we were officially notified that the Germans are telling French civilians that the Allied invasion forces would be led by American paratroopers, all of them convicted felons and psychopaths, easily recognized by the fact that they shave their heads, or nearly so." First Lieutenant Raymond Schmitz decided to ease the tension with some physical activity. He challenged Winters to a boxing match. "Come on, Winters, let's go out there behind the tents and box." "No, go away." Schmitz kept after him. Finally, he said, "Okay, let's wrestle." "Damn it, enough. You've been egging me long enough. Let's go." Winters had been a wrestler in college. He took Schmitz down immediately, but he threw him too hard. Schmitz suffered 2 cracked vertebrae, went to the hospital, and did not get to go to Normandy. His assistant leader of the 3rd Platoon, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Matthews, took his place, with Sergeant Lipton as his second in command. The rest of that day and night, on up to the time the men strapped on their parachutes, Winters had a constant line of troopers asking him, with smiles on their faces, to break their arms or crack their vertebrae. General Taylor circulated among the men. He told them, "Give me 3 days and nights of hard fighting. Then you will be relieved." That sounded good. 3 days and 3 nights, Winters thought to himself. I can take that. Taylor also said that when the C-47s crossed the coastline of France, he wanted every man to stand up. If a trooper got hit by flak, he wanted him to be standing and take it like a man. There was a point to the order that went beyond bravado. If a plane got hit, the men hooked up and ready to jump would stand some chance of getting out. Taylor told Malarkey's platoon to fight with knives until daylight, and don't take any prisoners. That night, June 4th, the company got an outstanding meal. Steak, green peas, mashed potatoes, white bread, ice cream, coffee, in unlimited quantities. It was their first ice cream since arriving in England 9 months earlier. Sergeant Martin remembered being told, "When you get ice cream for supper, you know that's the night." But a terrific wind was blowing, and just as the men were preparing to march to their C-47s, they were told to stand down. Eisenhower had postponed the invasion because of the adverse weather. Easy went to a wall tent to see a movie. Gordon remembered that it was Mr. Lucky, starring Cary Grant and Lorraine Day. Sergeants Lipton and Elmer Murray, the company's operations sergeant, skipped the movie. They spent the evening discussing different combat situations that might occur and how they would handle them. By the afternoon of June 5th, the wind had died down, the sky cleared a bit. Someone found cans of black and green paint. Men began to daub their faces in imitation of the Sioux at the Little Bighorn, drawing streaks of paint down their noses and foreheads. Others took charcoal and blackened their faces. At 20:30 hours, the men lined up by the plane load, 18 to a group, and marched off to the hangars. Nobody sang. Nobody cheered, Webster wrote. It was like a death march. Winters remembered going past some British anti-aircraft units stationed at the field. And that was the first time I'd ever seen any real emotion from a Limey. They actually had tears in their eyes. At the hangars, each jump master was given 2 packs of papers, containing an order of the day from Eisenhower and a message from Colonel Sink to pass around to the men. "Tonight is the night of nights," said Sinks. "May God be with each of you fine soldiers." Eisenhower's began, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking." In addition to the exhortations, the jump masters passed around air sickness pills. Who thought of the pills is a mystery. Why they were passed around, an even greater mystery, as air sickness had seldom been a problem. Something else was new. The British airborne had come up with the idea of leg bags. These bags contained extra ammunition, radios, machine gun tripods, medical gear, high explosives, and other equipment. They were to be attached to individual paratroopers by a quick-release mechanism and fastened to his parachute harness by a coiled 20-foot rope. When the chute opened, the trooper was supposed to hold the weight of the leg pack, pull its release to separate it from his leg, and let it down to the end of the rope. It would hit the ground before he did. In theory, the trooper would land on top of the bundle and not have to waste any time looking for his equipment. It seemed sensible, but no one in the American airborne had ever jumped with a leg bag. The Yanks liked the idea of the thing and stuffed everything they could into those leg bags: mines, ammunition, broken-down Tommy guns, and more. The men threw their kits, parachutes, and leg bags into the waiting trucks, climbed in themselves, and were driven out to the waiting planes. "With that done," Winters wrote in his diary, "we went to work harnessing up. It's here that a good jump master can do the most for his men, getting all that equipment on, tied down, make it comfortable and safe, then a parachute over the top, calls for a lot of ingenuity and sales talk to satisfy the men that all's well. Dressed for battle, they sat under the wings of the planes, waiting. The nervousness increased. "This is the jump where your problems begin after you land," they told one another. It was the $10,000 jump. The men had $10,000 GI life insurance. Men struggled to their feet to go to the edge of the runway to relieve themselves, got back, sat down, and 2 minutes later repeated the process. Joe Toya recalled Lieutenant Meehan coming over to his plane to tell the men, "No prisoners. We're not taking any prisoners." At 2200, mount up. The jump masters pushed their men up the steps, each of them carrying at least 100 pounds, many 150 pounds. One 101st Trooper spoke for all 13,400 men in the 2 airborne divisions when he got to the door of his C-47, turned to the east, and called, "Look out, Hitler! Here we come!" At 2310, the C-47s began roaring down the runway. When they reached 1,000 feet, they began to circle, getting into a V of V's formation, 3 planes to each V. As they straightened out for France, most of the men found it difficult to stay awake. This was the effect of those pills. Through that night and into the next day, paratroopers had trouble staying awake. Joe Toya did fall asleep on his flight. "I was never so calm in all my life," he recalled. "Jesus, I was more excited on practice jumps." On Winter's plane, Private Joe Hogan tried to get a song going, but it was soon lost in the roar of the motors. On Gordon's plane, as on most, men were lost in their own thoughts or prayers. Private Wayne Sisk of West Virginia broke the mood by calling out, "Does anybody here want to buy a good watch?" That brought a roar of laughter and a lessening of the tension. Winters prayed the whole way over, prayed to live through it, prayed that he wouldn't fail. Every man, I think, had in his mind, "How will I react under fire?" With Lieutenant Schmidt in hospital, Sergeant Lipton was jumpmaster on his plane. The pilot gave the paratroopers a choice. They could ride with the door off, giving them fresh air and a chance to get out if the plane was hit, or ride with the door in place, which would allow them to smoke. They chose to take it off, which allowed Lipton to lie on the floor with his head partly out the door. Most of the men were asleep, or nearly so, a consequence of the air sickness pills. As the C-47 crossed the channel, Lipton saw a sight no one had ever seen before, nor would anyone ever see again, a sight that every man who was in the air that night never forgot. The invasion fleet, 6,000 vessels strong, heading toward Normandy. Gordon Carson was with Lieutenant Welsh. As the plane crossed the channel, Welsh told the men near the front, "Look down." They did, and all you could see was wakes. No one ever saw so many ships and boats before. Carson commented, "You had to be a little bit awed that you were part of a thing that was so much greater than you." At 0100, June 6th, the planes passed between the islands of Guernsey and Jersey. In his plane, the pilot called back to Winters, 20 minutes out." The crew chief removed the door of the plane, giving Winters, standing number 1, a rush of fresh air and a view of the coast. "Stand up and hook up," he called out. The red light went on. At 0110, the planes passed over the coast and into a cloud bank. This caused the formation to break up. The lead V plowed straight ahead, but the Vs to each side veered off. The one to the right breaking away in that direction, the one on the left over the opposite way. This was the natural, inevitable reaction of the pilots who feared mid-air collisions. When they broke out of the cloud bank, which was only a mile or two across, every pilot was on his own. Only the lead pilots had the device that would lead them to the Pathfinder's Eureka signals. Pathfinders were specially trained volunteers who dropped in an hour ahead of the main body of troops to set up a radio beacon on the DZ to guide the lead plane. Easy's Pathfinders were Corporal Richard Wright and Private Carl Fenstermaker. With the formation gone, none of the others knew when or where to turn on the green light. They could only guess. Lost, bewildered, frightened, the pilots immediately had another worry. Anti-aircraft fire began coming up at them, blue, green, and red tracers indicating its path. It was light stuff, 20 and 40 millimeter. When it hit the planes, it made a sound like rocks being shaken in a tin can. On Harry Welsh's plane, some ack-ack came through exactly where he had been sitting a minute before. The pilots were supposed to slow down before turning on the green light, but as Gordon put it, here they were thrust into the very jaws of this violence, and they had never had 1 minute of combat experience, so they were absolutely terrified, and rather than throttle down, they were kind of like a fellow thinking with his feet. They fought with that throttle, and they said, "My God, common sense will tell me the quicker I get out of here, the better chance I have of surviving. And that's unfortunate for the boys back there, but be that as it may, I'm getting out of here." So they increased speed, up to 150 miles per hour in many cases, and although they did not have the slightest idea where they were, except that it was somewhere over Normandy, they hit the green light. Men began shouting, "Let's go! Let's go!" They wanted out of those planes. Never had they thought they would be so eager to jump. Lipton's plane was bouncing and weaving, and the men were yelling, "Let's get out of here!" They were only 600 feet up, the 40-millimeter anti-aircraft tracers coming closer and closer. About the time the tracers were popping right past the tail of the plane, Lipton remembered, the green light went on. He leaped out. Private James Alley was number 2, Private Paul Rogers number 3. Alley had been told to throw his leg bag out the door and follow it into the night. He did as told and ended up flat on the floor with his head and half his body out of the plane, his bag dangling in the air, about to pull him in half. Rogers, who was strong as a bull, threw him out the door and jumped right behind. Leo Boyle was the last man in the stick on his plane. There was this tremendous turbulence as the green light went on and the men began leaping out into the night. The plane lurched. Boyle was thrown violently down to the floor. The plane was flying at a tilt. Boyle had to reach up for the bottom of the door, pull himself to it, and roll out of the C-47 into the night. Tracers were everywhere. The lead plane in Stick 66, flown by Lieutenant Harold Capilouto, was hit with bullets going through it and out the top, throwing sparks. The plane maintained course and speed for a moment or two, then did a slow wing-over to the right. Pilot Frank DeFleeta, just behind, remembered that Capilouto's landing lights came on, and it appeared they were going to make it when the plane hit a hedgerow and exploded. It was the plane carrying Lieutenant Meehan, First Sergeant Evans, and the rest of the company headquarters section, including Sergeant Murray, who had held that long talk with Lipton about how to handle different combat situations. He never got to experience any of the possibilities he and Lipton had tried to visualize. Easy Company had not put one man into combat yet, and it had already lost platoon leader Schmitz, company commander Meehan, and its first sergeant. Private Rod Stroll was one of those so overloaded that he could not put on his reserve chute. I remember thinking, well, hell, if you need it and it doesn't open, it's going to be over in a hurry. And if you don't need it, you don't need it. His plane got hit and started going down. As his stick went out, the pilot and co-pilot came out with us. George Lutz was on Welsh's plane. He had barely made it, as in addition to all the regular gear, he was carrying a radio and batteries, and had been unable to get into the plane until a bunch of Air Corps guys pushed him in. Once inside, he had turned to Welsh to say, "Lieutenant, you got me fifth man in the stick, and I'll never make it to the door." So Welsh had told him to change places with Private Roy Cobb. When the flak started, you could walk on it, Lutz remembered. Carson said, "We wanted to get out of there so damn bad it was unbelievable." Cobb called out, "I'm hit." "Can you stand up?" Welsh shouted. "I can't." "Unhook him," Welsh ordered. Mike Ranney unhooked Cobb from the static line. Private Rader recalled, "Cobb was some pissed. To have trained so hard for 2 years and not get to make the big jump was hell." Just then the red light went on, flashed a second, and was hit by flak. I had no way of telling anything, Welsh recalled. So I said, "Go," and jumped. Lutz kicked his leg bag containing the radio and other equipment out the door and leaped into the night. Thus did 13,400 of America's finest youth, who had been training for this moment for 2 years, hurl themselves against Hitler's Fortress Europe.